Hey there.
Hi, nice to see you. Good to do this. I'm at your service, so you just fire the questions and we'll see where we go.
Okay, well, you probably get this a lot. This is you are so you are an inspiration in terms of making words alive, of making poetry, especially for people. I came from a background that didn't really appreciate it. It was rural farming. It was, it was working and then coming into academia a little bit. And I think the first time I saw you was at Regent, and it was in
Oh, right. Yeah,
2009.
I enjoyed all my Regent stuff.
and and seeing you and then seeing some different clips of you and your reading. And I think it was in 2019 I got a couple of your books and I gave it to my sister who's a chaplain. She was a chaplain in Halifax, and so she got the singing bowl. And I said,
Oh, yeah.
now if you really want a lovely experience, what you want to do, it's totally worth it. Here are the links to the poems and then listen to them. She, oh. You might, well, you do the pipe smoking. I was gonna have the pipe, and then I thought I've got a little bit of a cold, I better not. But I thought you might appreciate this. It's called Presbyterian mixture.
Oh, I've had that. Somebody gave me, I'm just looking at my pipe now. Somebody gave me that. Actually, interestingly, in Northern Ireland, a good place to find Presbyterians. And I was talking to some guys there that smoke pipes, and one of them produced a tin of Presbyterian mix and gave it to me. It was very good.
Right. For some people here, it was kind of seen as a, are you mocking the Presbyterians? No, you're putting the
No,
fire
no,
for
I
the
think hey,
Presbyterians.
the one I'm smoking right now is happily called Brandywine Bridge,
Ah, okay.
and it's from Ravenwood Fine Provisions, or the BriarFellowship.com. Anyway, somebody gave that to me when I was in Nashville. I'm just coming to the end of the rather good tin of it, but I really like the painting on the cover as well.
So just to start, when did you first meet Lucy? Like, how did you get acquainted with her? What was your first thoughts when you got in contact with
No,
her?
it was actually quite some time ago now. I think it was around might have been as early as 2002, but certainly the very early 2000s. And what happened was that the C.S. Lewis Foundation, which is based in California but does international events, they have or used to have every 3 years they had an event they called Oxbridge, where they would have a week in Oxford and a week in Cambridge, and bring people over, but also have local speakers. And that particular one, I was leading a devotion. That was the first thing. Was my, I'd been introduced to them by one of my students, and the that had been one at which Madeleine L'Engle was going to be given a kind of lifetime achievement award by the
Mhm.
Lewis Foundation, which would have been great. I'm a big Madeleine L'Engle fan, but Madeleine wasn't well enough to come, and of course Lucy's a great friend of hers. So Luci Shaw was there to receive this award, which was awarded while we were in Cambridge. I was part of the Cambridge week of this, so I was on home turf. But obviously, since they had Luci Shaw, she was doing a poetry reading as well. So as I say, I wasn't even a keynote at that point. I was just, I think it was 2002. I was, I was leading one of the morning devotions, and Lucy had liked that and sort of said hi, and I'd been to her poetry reading at this same event and really liked her. So I very much felt like the kind of unknown supplicant. I was really impressed by her as a person, and obviously she told stories about Madeleine, her friendship with Madeleine, and very graciously accepted this prize on Madeleine's behalf. And so I kind of, took my courage in my hands, and I had a little self-produced chat book, kind of booklet of poems. At that point, I didn't have proper publisher or anything. Um, but I had some poems in there that I thought she might like. And I think, I'm not sure if I'd written No Radix at that point, but there were various poems. So I did that thing, which actually now lots of people do with me, at conferences, which is like, here's my poems. And I understand now, because I get given a lot of those, it's really quite a task to try and remember them all and read them all and then find the address if it was sort of one to a different, and try and respond. You do your best, but you can't do it all. Anyway, she did respond, and she wrote to me and said, I really like these poems. And she said, I'm, uh, I knew she was a kind of poet in residence at Regent, but she said, I'm also a poetry editor for a journal called Radix. And if you would like to submit a poem or poems for inclusion in Radix, I'd be, well, not in Radix, sorry, in Radix, and then in Magdalene. In Radix, I think she may have given me or sent me a copy of the journal, which I was impressed by. So she said, if you'd like to submit a poem or poems, send them to me. And I had this poem, as it happens, Radix. And I mean, I really liked the name Radix. Obviously, it's the Latin for the word root. And it's the root, therefore, of words like radical. And I was of the view that Christianity is a really radical religion, that it takes you back to the very roots of what it is to be human, and that really the Beatitudes and all the parables of the kingdom represent a radical critique of a lot of the way we live now. But I also loved the idea, which is there in these Advent antiphons, that one of the titles of Christ is Radix, O root, O root of Jesse, is the allusion in Isaiah. So I had written this sequence of 7 poems based on these great O antiphons, one of which was O Radix. And in that poem, I thought about Christ as a root in a much deeper sense. He's the word from whom all things are made. He's the in fact, I call him at one point the stock and stem of every living thing, and Christ as So I wrote this poem as part of this sequence. I just sent that one to Lucy. I mean, I can read it to you if you like.
Please, I'd love that.
So I didn't know at the time I sent this how much Lucy loves and writes about green growing things and gardening and how green fingered she is, as it were. I mean, so I struck it lucky in the sense that I think I sent her a poem which was quite likely, although I didn't really know that at the time, to resonate. Though I was beginning to get to her poems, I think I bought one of her poetry books at that occasion. And happily, since then, we've met many times and we've been in correspondence, and she kindly sends me books and even sends me things to write little blows for. And of course, I then began sending her ones. So we had a bit of more of a kind of poets together collaboration. Anyway, here's the poem that I sent to her. And you have to remember that, as I say, I'd had a self-published little pamphlet. I'd had poems in student magazines. At this point, later on, I had this poem in some other journals. Later on, the whole sequence was published in a journal called Christianity and Literature in America and in the Church Times here. But at this point, I was much more in the role of kind of comparatively unknown wannabe poet, as opposed to, better known or whatever. Anyway, here's the poem I sent her, O Radix. All of us sprung from one deep hidden seed, rose from a root invisible to all. We knew the virtues once of every weed, but severed from the roots of ritual, we surf the surface of a widescreen world and find no virtue in the virtual. We shrivel on the edges of a wood whose heart we once inhabited in love. Then I'm addressing Christ here, I say. Now we have need of you, forgotten root, the stock and stem of every living thing, whom once we worshipped in the sacred grove. For now is winter, now is withering, unless we let you root us deep within, under the ground of being, graft us in. And obviously that passage at the end, I'm riffing on the extraordinary and very beautiful metaphor that Paul uses in Romans 11 about the natural olive and the wild olive. When he's thinking about how can Gentiles become part of God's plan, which was originally a plan for Israel to bless the whole world. How is it that the established people in Israel at the time of Jesus, rejected him? He has that extraordinary thing about the natural olive and a branch being severed from it and a new branch being grafted in. As a metaphor, And that metaphor is very deep. I mean, it's deep in Paul because it's deep in the scriptures that Paul knew and loved. And it's obviously there are the trees of life and of the knowledge of good and evil in the paradise. But Paul is almost certainly also thinking about the tree metaphor that opens up the book of Psalms, that blessed is the man that hath not walked in the counsel of the ungodly, Psalm 1, where it says, he shall be like a tree planted by the waters that bringeth forth his fruit in due season. His leaf shall not wither. Now, I think that metaphor goes deep in Paul, and it's there again in that astonishing prayer of blessing in Ephesians 3, which was also in my mind when I wrote this poem, where he prays for the Ephesians that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have power to comprehend with all the saints what is the length and breadth and height and depth, and know the love of God which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of Christ. So there we have that. And, I'm saying, I want to be rooted like that. And I was writing, I was a college chaplain. I was very conscious of people feeling, this being a kind of rootless generation, people not being sure where they came from, people, I was writing to a generation who I felt, severed from the roots of ritual. And of course, it's interesting that the sort of quiet revival that we're having here in the UK, and I think also a lot of the younger people are coming back to churches that have ritual, that have roots, that have some historical depth, because they want something that lasts. They want something deeply grounded. They feel that rootlessness, and they want to put down roots, not in the sense of, I'm going to get a mortgage, but put down roots in the sense that I want to be grounded in something permanent and eternal. So all that was woven into that poem in various ways. Anyway, Lucy wrote back and said, I really like this. And as it's called O Radix, and I'm editing a journal called Radix, it'll be just right. So I was thrilled. So I can think of her in some sense that as a kind of almost like a patron and mentor. Anyway, she thereafter, very graciously, because she was certainly far better known than I was at that time, very graciously treated me as a kind of fellow poet and, part of that circle. And I've never forgotten that.
Mm-hmm. 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 I've heard it said from a variety of different people that she totally believed in nurturing. The relationships were really, really important to her, and that trying to nurture any other poet who happens to be working in that field to get them to flourish as much as possible. I'm
Oh,
assuming you would agree with
absolutely.
that.
And I think nurture and flourish are really important words there. I think she probably saw us as, little potted seedlings that needed to be sort of planted in deeper ground and watered a bit and all of that. So subsequently, I hadn't expected this. Some years afterwards, must have been, more in 2008 or 9. I can't remember the details of this. But I think Jeremy Begbie kindly suggested to Regent College that I might be a good person to come and talk about theology and the arts, because my book was coming out or had come out, Faith, Hope and Poetry. That came out in 2010, so it is quite some years off. And I began a relationship with Regent where I've gone over there many times, and I've also done online courses for them and so on. Now, at some point in one of those, because I knew Lucy was kind of the poet in residence of Regent, I was really hoping to see her. I don't think I saw her the first time I was there. I mean, she was living in Belmont, I think, but she would come up. Anyway, I think at least the second time I was there, she showed up and wrote to me to say, I'll be at Regent when you're at Regent. And we did more or less impromptu. I mean, it wasn't, she said, let's do a poetry reading together. And so we did this poetry reading together at Regent, which I was thrilled to do. I remember she was looking very chic. She had a leather jacket, actually. This sort of rather lovely kind of close crop silver hair and this very fine bone structure of her face. And she was very cool in my view. So we did this poetry reading together, and it went down really well. And we sort of gestured to one another, and we swapped poems back and forth. And it really made me feel that we were definitely, to carry on the horticultural metaphors, we were definitely working in the same vineyard, as it were. And that was wonderful. So then for me, the absolute apotheosis of this was when some time later, to my surprise and honour, I was asked by Regent College to deliver the Lang Lectures, which is this big set piece named 3 lecture things. And as Richard Lang had, endowed this lectureship, you go and give 3 lectures over 3 days. And I mean, some really distinguished people had done it before, like Iain McGilchrist, for example. And I was really honoured to be asked to do this. So when I was working on these lectures, which was on imagination and the kingdom of God, I was dividing it into the poetic imagination, the moral imagination, and the prophetic imagination. Anyway, when it came to the poetic imagination, I wanted to use one of Lucy's poems, which I think is one of her absolutely finest poems. It's called Kenosis. Actually, I should have brought that form as well, but you may have it. Anyway, I think I'd by that time already included this poem in an anthology I'd produced for Canterbury Press about Advent, with a poem a day for Advent and Christmas and Epiphany, a book called Waiting on the Word. And so I decided to do quite a deep, close reading exposition of her poem Kenosis to illustrate something I wanted to say about the incarnation and poetic imagination, about how, I was riffing on Shakespeare's famous account of the poetic imagination, where it says, imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown and gives to airy nothing a local habitation. The poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation in your name. And I was talking about how poetry wants to incarnate things, to body things forth, and how the great reason why you need poetry, particularly in the church, is that the danger for the church and theology is a flight away from the body and the rootedness and the incarnate into abstract language, what the poet Edwin Muir calls abstract calamity. He says about bad church that the word made flesh is here, made words again, And I thought Kenosis was a brilliant poem for many reasons, but what she does in that poem is she takes this Greek word, which is the technical word we use for the self-emptying, which is described in Philippians, though he was found in form equal to God. He did not cling to equality with God, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. But the word kenosis, and for that matter, the word incarnation, are abstract theological terms. And what I thought the genius of her poem called Kenosis was that it immediately takes you away from an abstract word and it gives you the image of Christ suckling at the breast of Mary and its skin and his infant mouth working in and out. It's just so, I feel it's a poem that only a woman could have written, that she's the babe at the breast. And then it gently, with real images about the rough plane and lathe, and it hints at the passion and the suffering that he will bear for all of us. And I thought it's an almost perfect poem. So anyway, I was going to quote this, and then I thought, look, the real poet is around. Why don't I write to Lucy and ask her if she would be kind enough to come to the lecture at which I was going to expound her poem and actually just get up and read it, so that she could quite literally body forth that poem. And happily she agreed to do that. And I regard that as one of the golden moments of my life, that I kind of introduced Lucy, and Lucy read the poem. And then Lucy was, of course, then sat down and was blushing while I told this really big audience precisely why, line by line and word by word, why that was such a brilliant poem. And it gave me pleasure to say that in front of her, because I know that when you write a poem, you have many layers of meaning in it and deep things. You wonder if anybody's ever really going to get it. And you rejoice at a reader who really gets what you're doing. And I just wanted Lucy to have the pleasure of knowing that here was this random Englishman who had read her poem and seen at least, a good deal of what she was actually doing in it. And so I praised her for that. And I regard that as one of the real moments. And obviously it was a kind of, seal on friendship. You want when somebody does something really admirable, you want the pleasure of telling them just how admirable it is and why. And I thank God that I had the opportunity to do that with and for Lucy.
Being there that night, I remember. And when she walked down and you do the regal, the walking, and she was so the composure and that I can't say that I remember exactly what was talked about, but I remember the feeling was very, very memorable. I could still have that.
I'm so glad you're there. It was I'm happy to share with you the memory of that moment. Anyway, so by this time, we got to know each other and we were following each other on Facebook and things like that. So I was following and she was writing new poems and sending them to me and I was sending mine to her. And she, so it really deepened into a literary friendship. And so I saw that her birthday was coming up and I decided to write a birthday poem for her. And she had just written some poems which had extended metaphors taken from gardening and from her love. And there was one about poetry and and gardening and the kind of attention and care of the gardener. So I decided to write a poem for her, which I can read, which is I eventually published in my collection Parable and Paradox, and it's simply called For Luci Shaw. And it probably says more about what I feel about her as a person and as a poet. And by the way, I think there was no mismatch or disconnect between the person and the poet. The person you meet in the poem and the person you meet in person was the same kindly, generous, observant, occasionally slightly arch person that you were meeting in the poem. So this was my tribute to Luci Shaw. In this book, I have tributes to two contemporary American poets. One is Lucy and the other is Scott Cairns. But anyway, this is the poem I wrote for Lucy. Lucy, I love the gift you have for green fingers in your garden, a green art in writing too, a feel for life and growth, kindly encouragement, and yet a keen eye for the form, for what needs weeding out. That's very good. To give a poem room to breathe and grow. I sense your patience when that growth is slow, knowing that slow growth bears a fuller fruit. I love your eye for detail too, the rich particularity of earthy things, the way you strike the right note till it sings, and all you have withheld is within reach. The poem opens for us and makes room for fleeting apprehensions to come home. I wanted to finish it with that. And the fleeting apprehensions is also a riff on the Shakespeare thing, where Shakespeare says imagination apprehends more than cool reason ever comprehends. And Shakespeare says we have to give those apprehensions a local habitation and a name. So that's the home thing. So that was very much, that pretty much epitomizes why I think she's such a good poet and what particular aspects of her poetry I think are good.
You gave a reading in it was a presentation or interview with maybe in the last 3 or 4 years. Lucy had written a 50th anniversary little pamphlet on the Inklings.
Oh yes, yeah.
And Radix has been, so the previous editor, she was very interested in the Inklings, and a larger group of us are interested. Obviously, you are very, very interested. But something that struck me was it used to be until Pavlac Glyer wrote, the name's not coming to mind.
Yeah, the company they keep.
Thank you. And there was this
Great
other
book.
this older idea that the Inklings kind of created what they became who they were individually. And Glyer's idea is no, that is not the case at all. And so I'm assuming that Lucy also muchly valued friendship in terms of, in that creating an internal flourishing that would not be able to be possible without having those, a great group of friends around her.
Yeah. Well, I think that's very true. Now, I think Diana Glyer's brilliant book is brilliant. I also like the little spin-off book she did, Bandersnatch, which kind of little reading book she did. So Diana has a list of the various roles that friends can take in a literary friendship to encourage, but also to critique. And one of those roles that she talks about, she is the resonator. So Lewis was to some degree a resonator for Tolkien. He got what Tolkien was doing when absolutely nobody else got it at all. And Tolkien said it for a while. He was his only reader, just saying, give me more of this. And I think Lucy was a resonator for me, I would say. That right from that early thing when I sent her that poem, she got it. And I was having trouble getting people in England to get it, partly because, I was using classical form and that was out of fashion with the little poetry magazines of the time, partly because I was fairly explicitly a Christian and that was also, out of fashion in a comparatively secular, sometimes aggressively secular sort of poetry establishment. So for me, it was a bit like two strikes and you're out, And so Lucy obviously shared my Christian faith, but though she doesn't always use form, I mean, she can use it when she wants to, but she, uses more. I mean, she uses very subtle half rhymes sometimes, as she does in that Kenosis poem. But she got what I was doing and basically fed that back to me. It resonated on the same frequency and said, do more of that. Not like some poets might say to you, they might be so full of themselves and their own style that they would only encourage other writers to write like them. No, I don't write like her. I have a different approach to form. I have a different kind of range of image and metaphor. I'm partly coming out of John Keats, but I'm coming out of John Donne and George Herbert. Now she loves George Herbert as well. She wrote a really good poem about George Herbert, but she resonated. And I think, if Diana Glyer were writing about me and Lucy as opposed to, Lewis and Tolkien, I think she'd recognize that Lucy was a resonator for me.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of something else for her, she had this ability to, I mean, in our age, you know more about this than most, certainly me, but there's this, especially in North America, this context of we're always wanting the big, the bang, the boom, the magnificent, the huge, and it ignores the small, the everyday, the mundane even. And
Yeah.
she made the mundane and the small and the simple and the domestic.
Yeah. She's got lots of poems about, little things you could just pick up and hold in your hand, but others might have dismissed, There's that lovely thing she has about the Petoskey stone. She uses it as a metaphor for polishing your craft. And but another poem of hers that I included in my Waiting on the Word anthology was a poem called Rocky Mountain Railroad Epiphany, which is about a railway journey, and it's just about looking out of the window, and it's a series of things she catches glimpses of looking out of the window. It's in that sense imagistic, and it doesn't, they say about good writing, show, don't tell. Don't tell me I'm meant to feel awe, or don't say I shall now feel a sense of the sacred. Write about something so beautifully and show it to me so vividly that my natural response is to see it as is my natural response is awe, or a sense of the numinous or the sacred, but don't sort of pile on the adverbs. So she has this series of little things that other people might not have noticed, glimpses. But they build towards something sacramental. They build towards a realization that by the same principle that Christ can be present in bread and wine, once you know that, once your inner eye has been trained, if you think of a sacrament as an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. I mean, that's the classic Anglican definition of it from the Book of Common Prayers, from the 39 Articles of Religion. I take the view, and I think she did too, that of course it's a very special and particular and covenanted grace when God in Christ makes himself present to you in bread and wine. But it is also a principle. Once you've learned to discern him there, then you can discern him elsewhere. And the most obvious first place elsewhere to discern him is in the poor, in people who need you, in people whose thirst you can quench or hunger you can satisfy. Because Jesus is very explicit that whatever you do for the least of these, you do it for me. So he's definitely telling you that he's sacramental. Almost certainly sacramentally present in the beggar you might be tempted to walk past rather than give something to. But you can take that principle further, that once you've learned that discernment, as it were, in the church context, it'll flash upon your inward eye, to borrow a phrase of Wordsworth's, when your outward eye is looking at something that somebody else might never have noticed. And she was brilliant at that.
You spoke earlier of Iain McGilchrist, and so that, the latest book that came out, The Matter with Things, and in close to the beginning, he's got this beautiful paragraph, but it starts off with attention changes the world, the way we see things.
Yes, absolutely. So this is very, she's a great payer of attention and helps you to pay attention. Now, this goes back, I mean, I haven't, I confess I haven't read The Matter with Things yet, although it's kind of on the pile. I mean, it's a huge work. I was amazed at how quickly Rowan Williams wrote his great review of it, how Rowan finds the time in the midst of everything else. But I've been able to have some conversations with Iain McGilchrist, and one of the places that we both connect with is Coleridge. And Coleridge uses the word attention when he's specifically talking about what it is poetry offers. In the 14th chapter of the Biographia Literaria, when he's looking back after 20 years at what he and Wordsworth thought they were up to in that Annus Mirabilis, when they wrote the lyrical ballads together, he says that the aim was, and I quote him directly here, was to awaken the mind's attention and to remove the film of familiarity, which our selfishness and solicitude have cast over the world. And as a result of which we have eyes that see not and ears that hear not and hearts that neither feel nor understand. So he's not saying, I mean, when I was doing courses in English literature, the standard line about the Romantics was that everybody was now admitting in amidst of industrialism and empiricism that everything out there was grim and meaningless, but the Romantics popped up to give us some compensatory prettiness and fantasy, and so that we could sort of decorate the insides of our minds with something moving and beautiful, notwithstanding the grim pointlessness of everything out there. Now, that is not true in any way whatsoever. I mean, it's not true that things are grim and meaningless, although it's true that people temporarily thought they were, and why they thought they were grim and meaningless and why they were wrong about that is partly what people like Iain McGilchrist and Charles Taylor are writing about. But Coleridge did not say, I'm giving you a compensatory fantasy so you don't have to look outside your window and see what's happening. On the contrary, he says, I'm awakening your mind's attention so you really see it and see it almost for the first time. Now, that insight is massively important. And it's true of almost all good poetry. And some poets, of course, subsequent to Coleridge, who understood that, really had their vocations sharpened. So the poem that completely answers to what Coleridge said poetry should do is written quite a number of years later by Gerard Manley Hopkins in the poem God's Grandeur, when he says the world is charged with the grandeur of God, it will shake out like shining from shook foil. And then he says, why don't we see it? Why do men now not reck his rod? And he says, generations have trod, and all is bleared with toil, smeared with toil, and where's man's, here's man's smell and where's man's smudge? Then he says, nor can foot feel being shod. And what he's saying is, of God's holy world, we need to take off our shoes from off our feet, for the place where we're standing is holy ground. And we need to be aware, as it were, of the burning bush everywhere, that the light of God can shine out from all of these things. And that's what poetry is about, and awakening the mind's attention. And if you see that as a key purpose of poetry, then Luci Shaw is right there in the center lane, because almost all her poetry has the function of awakening the mind's attention, because she herself is so capable of giving the gift of attention both to people and to the world around them.
In terms of your own, and you've talked about this elsewhere, but to get it into Radix would be nice if you don't mind. What daily practices would you suggest for the average person who they're not a great reader, they're busy kids, but there's always things that we can do to open ourselves up a little bit? What would
Yeah.
be something that you would suggest for the everyday person?
Okay, so if it's possible, and this is something I do, I literally do every day, twice if I can, 3 times on a good day, and that is to go for a walk, just to go out and walk and not be listening to music or a podcast on headphones while I'm walking. So I can actually hear the birds. I walk in a wood called Sadler's Wood, with which I've become very familiar. But I go to it and I look, and it's the kind of thing that, Annie Dillard does in A Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek. I mean, you go and you really look. And I find that practice to walk without an agenda, but to practice presence. And some people find it helpful to do that by actually going through their 5 senses and asking themselves, what can I see? What can I? Usually somewhere on my walk, I sit down, there's little benches and things in this wood, and I can sit down and I will almost certainly take in the sounds there and will think about the feel of, a breeze on my skin or whatever. Now, I'm not doing this, as it were, in a utilitarian way, saying, I hope I get a good poem out of this or whatever. I'm doing it as an end in itself. I'm doing it on the assumption that one of the things that God does in and through each of us is give myriad moments of vision of his cosmos, that everybody experiences the world slightly differently, and each of those slight differences of experience contributes to the multifaceted nature of things. I mean, I think, Lewis's epitaph for Joy, which was partly adapted from he wrote for Charles Williams, says that when he buried her, he buried the sun and the stars and the sky and the fields as they had been seen by her. But that these will rise again after Lenten lands, and we all finally share it. So simply to look at God's world as one of his unique creatures, therefore with a unique perspective on God's world, simply in God's presence, as a matter of the practice of the presence of God, to note it and say, glory to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit, as you notice it, is to fulfill one of the meanings of one's creatureliness, that one was meant. One was given this particular view. I'll tell you a story. That's why Cambridge is lovely, because of all the kind of long continuities that go on. So one time my spiritual director in Cambridge was a guy who had Simon Barrington-Ward. He was a retired bishop at that point, but he had been the young chaplain at Magdalene College in Cambridge when Lewis was there. And so he'd been Lewis's chaplain, and he had lovely stories. But he said Lewis used to take him for walks sometimes, and he was kind of in awe. He was a young man. He was in awe of Lewis, he was walking on. And then, as he would do, a young man, you'd be trying to impress Lewis and say things. But so he and I, Simon Barrington-Ward and I, were doing a very famous walk together that, people have done since Chaucer's time, from Cambridge to the village of Grantchester, along Grantchester Meadows. So we're coming along Grantchester Meadows, and a couple of swans came into view, sort of in a shaft of sunlight. And Simon Barrington-Ward turned to me and said, "Do you know, this happened to me when I was walking with Lewis." It was around sort of time. He said, "We were walking just here, and these swans came into view. And I was trying to impress Lewis, and I quoted a line of Matthew Arnold. I said, 'Look, you're last on all things lovely.' And he said, Lewis seized me." And he said, "No." He said, "Look, you're first on all things lovely. You and I," said Lewis to Simon, "we're the first people to have seen these swans at this moment in this light. Look, you're first on all things lovely." And, it was a wonderful moment. But that is all of that, it's about attention and about seeing, and luckily for us, I mean, Lewis talks about when he buries Joy, a whole view of the world has gone. Of course, Joy was a poet too, but Lucy has left us a series of beautiful moments of vision where, to borrow my phrase, there's been a lifting of the veil, the film of familiarity has been removed. So we can, through her poetry, look at the world through her eyes. And that's something very well worth doing.
That makes a beautiful, perfect conclusion.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's nice. I didn't know where we were going to go with this, but that's really nice. Brilliant.
Thank you so much for your time and for you being yourself. God bless you.
Okay, great to see you. God bless. Bye.